Welcome to Bible Thoughts, a podcast from Coram Deo Church. Bible Thoughts is all about taking small bites out of God's Word, wherever you are, and just chewing on them for a bit. I'm Rusten Harris, your host. Thank you for listening. Today's Bible Thoughts is coming from Exodus chapter 14. So the context of this passage is that it is the climactic, cliffhanger, edgy part of the story that Exodus has been leading up to. This is the passage that is right at the threshold of the climactic deliverance of God's people from the cruel hand of Pharaoh. You'll remember they were slaves. They were victims of cruel oppression, and they were victims of crushing slavery, and the height of their oppression was really evidenced in the first chapter of Exodus, where Pharaoh is literally force aborting Hebrew babies by making people throw them into the Nile. So God's people have had it pretty rough under Pharaoh. But at this point in the story, God has already unleashed his 10 plagues upon Egypt, including the climactic last plague, which was the death of the firstborn. And through these plagues, he's really disarmed Pharaoh of any semblance of power that he might with any reason believe that he still has. God, through the plagues, is basically saying to Pharaoh, you don't have any power because everything you think that gives you power is actually completely under my command. That's what God does with the plagues. He's over the Nile. He's over the sky. He's over the sand. He's over the frogs. He's over the hail. He's over everything. He's over the light. The darkness that he displays shows that he's over light itself. So God has displayed himself as so powerful as to disarm Pharaoh of any power that Pharaoh might think he has. And now, at this point in the story, after the last plague, God's people have been let go, and they are fleeing out of Egypt. And God leads them to the Red Sea, where they will witness God's final deliverance and judgment upon Egypt. Before reading our passage, it's important to recognize that what happens at the Red Sea is completely, beginning to end, by God's sovereign plan. God is over all history. God is over all things. God has an intention behind the whole Exodus story. He knew the 10 plagues. He knew that they would come out in the way that they did. He knew that it would climactically end with the death of the firstborn, and he knew that Pharaoh would chase the Israelites to the Red Sea. He knew it, and he actually planned it. It was part of his sovereign plan. God makes this abundantly clear to Moses in the beginning of chapter 14. When the people are fleeing from Egypt, God has them camp, we're told, between Migdol and the sea. God basically tells them, stop moving, pause here, and wait. Wait for what? Well, it seems to be that they're waiting for the Egyptians to come. To chase them. And I don't think that all the Israelites quite knew that. But God tells Moses, God tells Moses that God will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts. That's why he has them camp between Migdol and the sea. So, what happens? Well, Pharaoh realizes after a short while that by letting the Israelites go, he's just lost his entire slave population, and he can't have that. And like some sort of rage-drunken monster, he completely forgets that the reason he let them go was because of the power that God displayed in the plagues in the first place. So, Pharaoh, he enlists all of the chariots in the kingdom to chase after these runaway Hebrew slaves. Chariots, by the way, they were the top-grade military asset of the time. And as the people of Israel are camped between Migdol and the sea, what do they see on the horizon? They see the dust in the air of 600-plus chariots with rage-filled Egyptians heading their way, probably with swords and bows and arrows in hand. And that's the context of our passage. That's the point at which this passage that I'm going to read to you occurs. So the dust is still in the air, and the people of God are camped at Migdol, and they see this looming threat. So here's the passage, Exodus chapter 14, verses 10 to 14. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is it not what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." And Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." So, even though these Israelites witnessed the way that God protected them during the time of the plagues, here they are, panicking at the coming chariots. It says that they feared greatly, and their fear of Pharaoh resulted in them wishing they were back in Egypt, slaving away, having their babies killed, making bricks under the cruel taskmasters. Here's something that just sticks out to me. They fear man, and their fear of man makes them desire slavery. I think this is always the case. The fear of man and the fear of death always leads to slavery. Sometimes the fear is because your life is at stake, like it was for the Israelites. But sometimes this can be more mundane. It could also be because you fear losing man's approval. And that fear will also drive you to a kind of slavery. Note also that their fear wasn't implausible. I mean, if you were to take stock of the situation that they were in from the vantage point of most of our mainstream media commentators, how would you measure the situation? They're poor, they're exhausted, they recently were delivered slaves who were cornered by the Red Sea. And on the horizon, the greatest army probably in the world at that time, boasting the highest forms of their military-grade weaponry, is galloping towards them, and their intention is slaughter. What is the predicted outcome? What do statistics and algorithms and calculations tell us? Should the people fear? Do they have warrant based upon a statistical analysis of this particular situation? What do you think? What would the mainstream media think? Here's the problem with this kind of approach. Statistics and algorithms and human measurement is always faulty when it evaluates situations like these while excluding God. God just messes with our statistics and our calculations. And yet this happens all the time. We do this all the time. I hear so many Christians making moral concessions to the culture that is opposed to God, by the way, because some statistician who excluded God from his measurements and algorithms made an evaluation based on statistics while excluding God's true word. So for instance, this is kind of what I'm talking about. This is one of the main ways I see this lately, although I've seen it in many, many forms. Take the issue of transgenderism, okay? In this issue, some Christian will be berated by calling transgenderism sinful and by calling the affirmation of transgenderism sinful. And they'll be berated on the basis of some statistical analysis that interprets the data and makes the claim that not affirming transgenderism contributes to transgender suicides. And then the Christian, upon hearing this statistical analysis, cowers in fear that the truth of God's word might actually result in psychological harm. So I better shut up. I better not speak truthfully because I fear the outcome. I fear the outcome based on man's statistical analysis more than I fear the outcome on God's declared word. So what's the problem with this? It's based completely upon the exclusion of God from the equation. How do we know that it isn't the other way around? You have to put faith in a psychologist's word rather than God's word in order to make that claim. What if transgenderism leads to psychological dysphoria and self-harm because it necessarily puts someone in conflict with the very existence and life that God gives them? All sin is running from God, who is the source of life. The person who thinks that affirmation is what people need to be psychologically whole has given into the lie that it is the approval of man that gives us life and meaning. It's like saying the fear of man is more important than the fear of God, and it's dangerous to forsake the God of the living. It is dangerous to fear anything more than him. And if you don't fear God, you will fear man. And that's what we see in this passage, the fear of man. But what does Moses say to this panicking people? He says, "Fear not. Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You have only to be silent." God is going to fight for them. All you have to do is be silent, Moses says. Just sit back, watch, trust me, trust my word. This is why I have you here. I'm going to display my glory over the Egyptians. I'm going to show you that I am to be more feared than they are. And that is how I will fear you from the slavery of the fear of man. So what does God do? He makes an impossible way through the Red Sea. That's what happens after this passage. And the people of God, they walk right through. And God lures the Egyptians in after them. And the salvation of God's people ends up also being the destruction of his and their enemies. The Israelites walk through the sea on dry land, and the Egyptians are crushed by the waters. Who could have measured? Who could have predicted what God had sovereignly planned and executed? Well, if the Israelites had remembered what he did in the plagues, maybe they wouldn't have feared so much. But in this act of salvation, God frees them not only from slavery to Egypt, but also from the fear of Egypt. So after they passed through the Red Sea, at the end of this chapter, we're told this: Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. If you fear man, you will become a slave. But if you fear God, you will fear man very little. And after they're rescued through the Red Sea, what do? You know, all of chapter 15, after this is most of it, actually, is a song. They're praising God for deliverance. We're told in that chapter they sang and they danced. The fear of man leads to slavery. The fear of God leads to singing and dancing. The Exodus, of course, also applies to us. Jesus is our great deliverer, and he's given us reason to not fear man or fear death. In fact, we read in Hebrews chapter 2 that since, therefore, the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. Slavery. Jesus crushes the head of the serpent, and he frees us from the fear of death, which was the thing that put us into a condition of being subject to lifelong slavery. That's just like the Exodus event here. In the cross and resurrection of Christ, the devil has been crushed like Egypt, and we have been freed from the fear of death and the slavery that comes with it, no matter how much the statistics and algorithms say otherwise. That is how it is, and that is the life that the Christian is called into, a life that is free from the fear of man, a life that is free from the slavery that comes from the fear of man, and a life that is free to rejoice and sing and dance and trust God at His word. Thanks for joining us for Bible Thoughts. I hope you enjoyed chewing on Exodus chapter 14. Until next time, keep chewing on the Word.